Hello, my name's Tony Mortimer. I've compiled a book called A Whole New Way of Perceiving the World. It's based on Nagarjuna, who was commonly known as the second Buddha, who lived around about 200 AD. He created the Madhyamaka school. I'm going to be just reading out from my book, and this topic is going to be on no self. So here we go. And before we go on, you can find my details by Googling Buddhist Nonduality Melbourne Nagarjuna. Okay, no self. The Buddha categorically states that there is no permanent self or ego in people. Since the body is impermanent, there certainly can be no permanent self abiding within it. The false sense of an intrinsic self, he says, is at the root of all our problems. Most of us have a compelling sense of a self that is permanent-like and unchanging. Buddhist thought argues against the very notion of such a permanent self. They claim that there is no such thing. That is, they deny that anything retains its identity over time. This is the doctrine of universal impermanence, and that even at a given moment there is no unchanging entity as to who we are, and nothing in us that fits this description. Despite noticing that everything in the world is constantly changing and is impermanent, and despite noticing that thoughts, feelings, perceptions and body sensations change every instant, we are all aging, we want there to be some kind of permanent, unchanging self within us that remains the same, something that will survive anything that might happen to our body-mind aggregates. Aggregates is the body parts. So one holds on tightly to this identity of a self or me. Either we assume there's someone in control of this body and mind, or that our awareness, volition, feelings and consciousness are a sign of something inherently real underneath everything. We may believe that this someone we assume is present within us or will disappear after our death, or that it will continue on in some way. But our conviction that we exist in this real and inherent way remains unshaken. Of course we exist. We are living beings. We make our choices, and our choices make a difference for ourselves and others. But at some level, for all of us, we cannot just leave it at that. To be real, to be alive, we feel that we must deep down somehow exist in a solid and independent way. Whereas the Buddha teaches that we exist contingently, dependently, and not independently. We exist but only in dependence on our ancestors, our body parts, our food, air and water. We could not and do not exist otherwise. Rather than seeing things as they are, we superimpose upon ourselves and on the things around us a false independent existence, a self-existence. An essential reality, an essence or a self. This that so-called intrinsic self, that subject of experience and agent of action, that underlying essence or core, but which the Buddhist philosophers argue does not exist, is the self that we all instinctively take ourselves to be and tenaciously protect and defend. So let us investigate and see if we can find or locate such an inherent self. For example, if a self exists, then we should be able to find it within either our body or our mind. We have to analyse each part to find where the sense of self comes from. You should investigate from the hair of your head down to your toes whether or not any particular part of your body is self. Could the self be the head, the legs, the torso, the skin, the heart, the brain, and so on? None of these, None of these body parts are candidates, body part candidates could be said to be an identical match with the self. Another reason the self cannot be the body or its parts is because the body is unconscious and the self is meant to be conscious. Perhaps then the self is the mind, such as feelings, thoughts, perceptions, cognition, consciousness, or awareness. But if the self is the mind, then which particular state of the mind is it? The mind undergoes a myriad states from its birth to its death. Yesterday I was happy, today I am depressed, and tomorrow I may be overjoyed. Which of these states represents the real me? It cannot be all of them, nor can I single out one of them. Likewise, the self cannot be our awareness or consciousness, because they are constantly changing like our mind. Perhaps it is something that lies behind the mental states, the locus upon which the mental fluctuations occur. But if this were the case, how could I know it at all, since it would be distinct from my thoughts? On what basis would I be able to convincingly postulate that such a thing existed in the first place? And the self cannot be the combination of its body-mind parts, because the combination of the parts encounters the same problems as the individual parts. And finally, the body-mind can't dwell in the self because the self is not established. According to standard Buddhist doctrine, the subtlest, deepest and most dangerous false belief held by humans is the belief in a permanent, independent self. Afraid of death and the possibility of our personal non-existence, we desperately impute and cling to a permanent, unchanging subject or self that is always there. There is something that seems to be me, what I feel as subjectively existing, unchanging and independent, and something that seems not to be me, that which is experienced apart from myself objectively. The self or me is like something in the background, something subjective, not objective, something apart from the body. This sense of self is not so much that we are the body, but rather we have a body. This self or me is perceived as a separate entity apart from the body. Hence the expressions, my body, my arm, my mind, my suffering, and so on. Whatever could be named, say arm, was not me, because it was my arm. The my or I seemed to be something different from arm. But where was this I? It's not as though we don't have a strong sense of it, but no matter where we look, it can't be found. By contemplating no self gives us certainty of its absence. The view that there is a self in here, in this body, that remains unchanged even as the body undergoes birth, growing, aging and so on, or even after death for some, or perhaps only in this life for others, constitutes the view of a subjective self or I. If you were to lose your hand, you still feel I am the same old me. That view, that the self remains unchanged, pertains to the stance or position of an inherent self, which factually simply cannot be found. Despite our wish to be something lasting, something permanent, we can't help noticing that everything is impermanent and disintegrating. Our bodies are disintegrating moment by moment right now. And though we desperately wish to believe otherwise, the truth is that beneath our ever-changing minds and aging bodies, there is nothing eternal, nothing permanent, nothing that remains unchanged. We are caught, as it were, between our sense of self as something unchanging and the knowledge of the inescapable state of transience or impermanence of everything. As the life story of the Buddha reveals, the Buddhist path was inspired by this very problem, and it offers us a way to resolve it. In fact, the erroneous belief in permanence, inherent existence, whether that be a permanent objects and things or a permanent self, has been the root cause of our confusion and suffering all along. The Buddha's teaching on impermanence serves as a correction to permanence. But once it has done its job, one should not cling to impermanence. Reality avoids both extremes, permanence and impermanence. Belief in an existent self is illogical. In any way we empirically observe the world, no intrinsic self can be found. Thus, maintaining belief in an intrinsic self after analysis is a result of personal discomfort with the idea that reality has no underlying and unchanging self or substance. The concept of no self is of great significance in Buddha's teachings. There is nothing from our experience, the way we experience life, perceive life, think and communicate, which would give the secret away. There are no hints. Even Sherlock Holmes could not have solved this one, or Poirot. It is completely contrary to what the appearance seems to indicate, and this is the teaching of no self. What the teaching says is that within this human being, consisting of mind and body, and the mental attributes of feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, there is no permanent personal entity or self which can be found to exist. There are perceptions, feelings, personality traits, physical parts such as hands, legs and heart, but no self. It does not sound right, Our experience seems to point back to someone in here, a me or a self. Even when people developed high states of meditation, as in India, where there were many different systems of religious teachers, spiritual seekers with their own systems of training of the mind, who were very accomplished, they simply were stuck on this appearance of a permanent self. There was a centre to all this subjective experience. There was a self, a centre point, someone in there who is experiencing. Therefore, every teaching that came out of India seemed to revolve around this one form or another, dealing with this self, or Atman, they called, or ego. In Christianity, we have the soul. So there are many different notions about this core, which is the real me. And everything else are attributes of me. My house, my money, my body, my thoughts, or my feelings. The me was the root of all these. So the Buddha in his teaching has burst the bubble and realised for himself that there was really no me, no self, no real point that was a centre, and he taught the teaching of no self. And he stated it in no confusing terms. He stated very clearly no self over and over again. There is no self to be found in this mind and body of any form, of any shape, either in or out of it anywhere. No self, full stop. But no self does not mean nothing, non-existence. No personality, no person. Of course you are there, the person sitting there. There is a mind and body, there is a personality, but no self. The understanding of no self is a well-kept secret. The signs are not easy to read. The conditioning is so strong. We have been taught over and over again that there is a real you and that it is within you. You believe it, whether you understand or not. However, we are fortunate that we have the seeds. The Buddha's seeds are being planted in our minds. Maybe actually there is nobody there, nobody at home at all. So you can't forget that now. In order to catch a thief, we have to know who the person is and what he or she looks like. The greatest thief of all is our mistaken sense that self and all other phenomena truly exist or inherently exist. We believe that things really exist the way they appear to our senses, as objectively established as existing from their own side. This, then, is what we have to know in order to catch this great thief who steals all our happiness and peace of mind. Therefore, we must recognise the false inherent sense of self, not selflessness, before we can start actually refuting or eliminating it. When we start observing how the false self, the self we have habitually assumed to exist in persons and objects, manifests, we soon discover that it does not exist at all. Before we begin cultivating this understanding, our sense of self seems to be really there, very solid and substantial. But as soon as we start checking, we cannot find it. It disappears. If the self truly did exist, the more we search for it, the more concrete it should become. We should at least be able to find it. But if it can't be found, how can it possibly exist? When someone calls you by your name, By the time you respond, there is some kind of some kind of concept or picture of yourself that has emerged in your mind. You may not get a very clear or lucid concept of this self, but you do experience some kind of rough imagery of yourself before you answer. This self is something that seems to exist independently of anything else. It's a sort of solid point, a fixed entity that is just there by itself. It becomes particularly clear when we're angry or afraid. We can provoke those emotions in contemplation, and while maintaining them, recognise how we conceive ourself The self seems to exist independent of causes and conditions, like parents, independent of its parts, and independent of being perceived. The self appears to be inherently existing. Not only does it appear to be inherently existent, we might also actually believe that it exists this way. This appearance and this belief make up the conception of inherent existence, the inherent existence of the self. The conception of inherent existence is said by Middle Way Buddhism to be the root of suffering. Moreover, just because we have the conception of an inherently existing self does not mean that such a really existent self exists. How do we ascertain an inherently existing self? For example, after a swift kick in the shin, or a false accusation, or a true one, a very palpable sense of an inherently existing self arises. Blood and anger might arise. The stomach might get queasy. How could they do that to me? I'll show them. This sense, fired up by the pain of indignation, seems to point to a self that is really there, and at the moment, a very offended self. This sense of self, not the insultedness, but the self that has suffered the insult, is a sense that feels like I am really there. This sense does not seem like a self that depends on causes and conditions. It does not seem to be dependent on its parts and pieces of the body-mind, and it does not seem to be dependent upon being imputed by thought. It seems like one very wronged but very real self. Other examples where we can ascertain an inherently existing self is that sense of disappointment when our football team loses, or we miss out on a job we wanted, or our political party loses, or we are enraged by the actions of others, incompetent, wasteful and unaccountable politicians, dodgy lawyers and so on. These are examples of aversion to things, but attraction to things also causes us suffering. The happiness we experience is short-lived. It is not long before our team loses. Grasping after things causes us great suffering. It is said in Middle Way Buddhism that this conception of inherent existence is a misconception. It is said to be a misconception because although things appear to exist in this way, they actually do not exist in this way, inherently, intrinsically. Although the conception of intrinsic existence is present, intrinsic existence itself, existence that does not depend on anything else, can nowhere be found. Nothing exists inherently or independently. But this does not mean nothing at all exists. we exist, but dependently. Dependent on our body-mind parts, dependent on food, and therefore we do not exist independently or inherently. We all have a valid proper sense of self or I, but then we additionally have a misconception of that I as inherently existing. Under the sway of this delusion, we view the self as existing under its own power, established by way of its own nature, able to set itself up. If there were such a separate I, self-established and existing on its own, its existence should become clearer and clearer under the light of competent analysis. In fact, the closer we look, the more it is not found. This turns out to be the case for all other things as well. The fact that you cannot find them means that those phenomena are not self-established by their own power. The misconception of self in persons, or a core or essence in phenomena, is like when a rope is mistaken for a snake in dim light. The snake is merely projected by the force of a mistaken mind. It is easy to understand that there is not the slightest trace of existence of a snake from the side of the rope. The moment that a person thinks that there is a snake where the coiled rope lies, the appearance of a snake arises in that person's mind. That appearance, however, is nothing but a projection imputed from the side or the mind of the person. From the side of the rope, there is no snake. We'll be going into that in everything's being an imputation of mind. They're not real objects out there, but they're what we construct out there. But more on that later. Just like a snake is imputed on a coil of rope, likewise an I is imputed or projected onto the appropriate constituents or aggregates of the body-mind. In other words, although clinging to I may occur, the object of clinging, an inherently existing I, is a mere figment, as non-existent as the apparent snake. Nothing within body and mind, the head, the legs, the skin, the brain, the mind, the feelings, is in even the slightest way the I. Nor can we find the I outside the body and mind, like a soul or a spirit. Hence the I is merely set up by concepts and imputed upon the body and mind aggregates. It is not established by way of its own entity. Still, the name I serves its function conventionally. One of the first things labelled, and the most troublesome, is myself. When we are born, we are given a name, and we grow up, and as we grow up, we learn to think of ourselves as things that self-exist. Like the other things that we learn how to name, like trees and so on. In this way, I gain a sense of permanent identity that persists through the various activities I do. Language is intimately involved because it is with language that our sense of self is constructed. Buddhist thought deconstructs our unexamined belief in the reification of language by revealing the contradictions that plague it. Awakening involves realizing that linguistic categories, including the I, do not refer to real things. There is no intrinsic entity that corresponds to the label I. So there is no core nature that will correspond to the label I. The I or self exists merely by imputation. It exists by labeling or by terms and concepts superimposed onto the body-mind aggregates from the side of the mind. However, when we consider our own sense of self, we don't really get the sense of an imputed self. The feeling we have is more as if the self exists inherently. Let me explain how the labeling or imputation works. For example, two people may impute contradictory characteristics on the one basis, say John. One might say John is likable, and the other says he is unlikable. From John's side, he can't be both. This is a contradiction. This shows that the qualities of likable and unlikable do not inhere in John, but are merely imputed on John through thought or conceptuality from the side of the mind of the observer. From the side of John, John does not have these qualities, likable or unlikable, nor any other qualities, nor the quality of a self. They are not in John. Everything we perceive, everything we experience, and everything we know is mediated through our mind. Nothing can exist apart from the mediation of the mind. The self is no exception. We can only know or be aware of the self through thought or mind. So the self is imputed by thought from the side of the mind. From its own side, from the side of the self, there is nothing out there, nothing independent and autonomous that is completely apart from the mind that we can pin down and point to. When we ask how the self exists in and of itself, apart from the mind, we never find a shred of a thing in itself. This is attested by logic and empirical evidence. An independent self cannot be found. The self is nothing more than a conceptual abstraction. It has no intrinsic nature in itself. It exists only by imputation from the side of the mind, something like a self or I in a dream. However, the self does not present its lack of independent nature to our senses. Instead, it deceptively appears to be a real entity, established in its own right. We have fallen prey to this deception. We have falsely perceived this imputed self to be a real independent entity. It is our identity. It is who we really are. And so it is this sense of our own self, which factually does not exist but is imagined to exist, that experiences such things as birth and death, suffering and depression, pride and arrogance, win and loss. We spend our whole lives protecting and defending this false sense of self through the accumulation of wealth, power and status, through the pursuit of perfection and self-promotion, and through the defeat and humiliation of our rivals. The anxious self, worried about its own insufficiency, is at the root of most human anxiety. The sense of self is intimately connected to body identification. We are obsessed with our body, my body, what we like or don't like about our body. This sense of my body gives us the false impression of a my or self in the background that is separate from our body And it is this very background my or self that we misperceive to be me, to be our true reality. We don't think we are our body, but rather that we have a body. We don't think that the body suffers, but rather that I suffer. It is this imagined sense of I or self, a self that exists only in our mind, that is the cause of all our problems. We are habituated that we have this intrinsic quality of self. It is a profound and compelling addiction. And on the basis of this addiction, addictive illusion, we suffer immeasurable torment. What we experience, our fears, our anxiety, our insecurity, our uncertainty, what happens after we die and so on, we misperceive as happening to me, to myself, which factually cannot be substantiated or found. So who is it that is born and dies? Who is it that wins or loses? Who suffers? And who faces an uncertain afterlife? For this reason, the recognition of the lack, emptiness of an intrinsic independent self is the most important thing we could ever understand. After all, the self does not exist intrinsically from its own side, but exists only by imputation, by thought from the side of the mind. It is this imagined illusory sense of self that we have unwittingly identified with that is the cause of all our woes. When we see the self lacks any nature of its own, our conviction of its reality begins to wane, along with the suffering and anxiety it engenders. In other words, we have a change of mind. After all, enlightenment or liberation is nothing more than a change of mindset. We're on to the last page. Since everything is impermanent, just summarising, since everything is impermanent, the Buddha concluded that there cannot be a permanent self abiding in people. What we take to be a self, according to the Buddha, is simply the body-mind aggregates, arising and ceasing. For example, the category of physical substance is an aggregate of earth, air, water and fire. And the category of psychological tendencies is an aggregate of habits, likes, dislikes, greed, willfulness, etc. The idea of a person is just a convenient way to refer to these five aggregates, five categories and aggregates of elements. It is dispositions and grasping that cause one to see an illusory self in the aggregates. Yet when examined, nowhere would there be found an organ or entity, as it were, which was an actual self or ego in this dynamic agglomeration of fluctuating elements. The appearance of the aggregates does not necessitate the existence of a self nestled behind the aggregates. Thus, he concluded, beings are empty of self or selfless. He, the Buddha, did not say that there was no appearance or experience of self, but rather that there was no actual person that can be found to act as a referent for the concept of self. We all use the label self, and we all experience a self as an apparent subject of our experience. But when we look for a substance or essence underlying the aggregates, no actual entity of a self can be found that corresponds to that experience of self. Wherever one looks, within or without, no actual self is found. Not finding such a self is in fact the key to liberation. So the key to liberation is not in finding something like finding a self. The key to liberation is in not finding. Enlightenment is not finding a self. To see this deception is to be free of deception. Or to see the deception is to be free of deception. When a sage has certainty that people are changing moment by moment, that is, they are impermanent, the sage has refuted within his or her mind that there is a permanent, unchanging self. Since the body-mind aggregates themselves are impermanent, the sage has certainty of no permanent self abiding within them. The sage understands that the self is imputed to merely the collection of their aggregates. Since a self who is imputed merely to the phenomena of his or her aggregates, the sage has certainty there is no intrinsic entity called self abiding either within or outside of the aggregates.